Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jason Durall, who is the creative director for RuneQuest and all things BRP at Chaosium. Jason has worked on a ton of different TTRPGs throughout his life, and he's also worked on a ton of different video games. I asked him to share his expertise in this interview on what makes good sandbox and side quest content for a tabletop role-playing game. I started off the interview by asking Jason, why is it important to include side quest and sandbox content in the first place? I'll jump across to the interview now, but first, please subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel, and thanks for watching.
Okay, I think it is important for there to be a lot of side quests or just sort of potential little things or tasks that players can do, because if you're trying to create a world that feels real and lived in, everyone you meet has various things they need or things they want. And it can add a little more richness to the environment if you have a random talk with a character and it's another string or another hook you can possibly pull characters into and get involved in. And even if you don't have any particular care about resolving their problem, it feels interesting, and it creates the idea that the world just isn't about the characters' monolithic end goal, that they can really, have interactions with people where they've got minor problems. And since many characters also have their own minor quests or background quests or whatnot, just things they want to accomplish related to their backstories or their personalities or their the cults they're in RuneQuest, for example, or their clans or their tribes or their families, all of these various strings that the players are sort of trying to tie to their characters and whatnot. It creates this really rich and sort of diverse world where there's all sorts of ways that you can progress forward. And sometimes, there's a certain delight in finding that unexpected, like, oh, well, how about if we just go resolve this little, problem with this farmer and take care of that, even though it doesn't bring you any closer to stopping the lunar army invasion or whatnot. Similarly, I worked in massively multiplayer online role-playing games for many, many years, designing quests. And it's always a great idea to layer quest upon quest, so that if you have a massive, large quest, you'll want to have, that's sort of the mechanic of you must go defeat this particular boss monster in this location. And the idea too is you want to sort of seed the area around that with lots of smaller quests, so players are always feel like they're progressing. They have multiple reasons to go into a zone, or if they are traveling through an area, they might be able to accomplish some little mini things, so that the larger end goal quest can be it's not that far off if you feel like there are sort of steps in the ladder or steps in the stair between here and there. So I think it's really important. And also it can add a lot of just richness and fun to gameplay, because if the players are not necessarily excited about what your end goal thing is, sometimes you can have an absolutely wonderful game session consisting of just little problems.
When you jump into a little problem or a side quest or some sandbox play that is really, really great, whether you wrote it, ran it, or just played it, what is good about it to you? What are the elements where you go, that was well designed, that was well written, that was a good piece of content?
Well, I think first of all, there's a compelling and a clear reason for doing what you're doing. And the ones that resonate to me have also a clear sense of accomplishment. It doesn't necessarily have to be an epic thing or a go kill 10 monsters, because those are inherently boring quests that are just basically designed to, feed level based gameplay, grinding experience points to get to a higher level. But I mean, like, for example, these little minor quests or sub quests or side quests or errands or whatever you want to call them. Like the ones that I feel are really cool, is really good, really emotional, is they feel fully realized. Like, it's not just the GM going, the farmer wants you to go bring his cow back. And, you feel like there's an actual story there. And the other thing that's really nice is when there's a feeling of closure, like a sort of a narrative, an ending that has an emotional satisfaction, sort of a release at the end of that. Like, I mean, even just you help the old lady across the street, a car nearly hits you. That's the danger. You get to the end and she thanks you profusely and pushes a little candy into your hand and, hobbles off. I mean, just it could be anything, however brief like that, but you feel like you've accomplished something and you haven't just wasted, half an hour of gameplay yammering with random NPCs about nothing in particular.
When you're writing a side quest or piece of sandbox content for someone, not just creating it and running it on the fly, but actually putting it into a book, putting it into a collection of resources, what are some of the thought processes that have to go in there when you need to balance things like the ability of a GM to be able to extract that information quickly or on the fly, or not have too much prep time, or be able to implement it easily into the main story?
Well, the things that I always look for are answering any easy questions, like, does this character have a name? Who are they? Like if somebody has a pull for a quest, or if they're just so that the GM doesn't end up sort of desperately, gears grinding because they can't think of a good name for this random NPC they're supposed to find, or the name of the pet store they need to go to, or something like that. I like to make sure that everything actually has a label, so to speak. I like to make sure that the quest can be summarized in like 1 or 2 bullet points. I like to make sure that it can be, if it's a sequence of minor little subquests, I like to make sure that there's clear ending and a clear progression from one to the other. I think about that book, that children's books, Pancakes. It's like I think it's by Eric Carle. It's about a little kid who wants pancakes in the morning, and his mother sends him on this. Basically, she's just trying to get him out of the kitchen for a few hours, I think. And she's sending him to, like, you have to go to the Milner and get the grain ground up, and you have to go out to the fields, and you have to milk the cows, and now you have to go to the butter churn lady who churns the butter, and it's a little absurd. You've got to go to the chicken coop and bring back eggs, and I think there's a bit where the kid's even tapping maple trees to get some syrup. And I'm thinking, this is a full day's work, and the mom's probably just having a cigarette in the kitchen waiting for the kid to come back. But the quests, the little story, it gives you a sense of how a village works, how trade and barter works, where food comes from. And, there's always a very natural theme to it. Like the kid he needs to go out and thresh some grain with this little grain thresher, and then he brings it to the mill and they grind it for him. And it's a series of quests, but also they all build to a satisfying release, and that the kid actually gets a plate of pancakes at the end of the story. But I like to make sure that there's both a naturalism to these things, that it doesn't feel arbitrary. And the other thing is, I like to have some sort of a clear and compelling reason why somebody else needs to get involved, like why the player characters need to be the ones to do that. And there should be an element of, if not danger, an element of complication or a social prohibition that makes the player characters the ones who need to interject themselves into the situation. Nothing is, in my mind, lamer than, or perhaps just weaker than stories in which the protagonist, these sort of side quests where you're basically walking something, 300 yards down the street and giving it to somebody else, or, please go out and gather 10 flowers in my in my garden, and you walk out and gather 10 flowers or whatever like that. That kind of stuff is the absolute bottom, just the lowest of quests, where you're just basically doing chores for somebody. And I don't think that's particularly interesting. But so each one should actually feel like a mini story. It has some stakes. It has a consequence for failing. If you can't help this person, then something very real happens as a result. So those are the ones that I like the most.
You've talked a lot about side quests, but another aspect of this kind of extended world is sandbox content, material that gives lore and that gives GMs something to draw from that isn't necessarily even structured as a quest, but just adds to the flavor of a game more generally. Can you talk a little bit about that and give us some insight into, how that fits into what you've said previously?
Well, I think that, yes, I think that it is important to use that kind of content. How you deliver it is ultimately the biggest question of whether it works or not. I'm absolutely not a fan of just huge info dumps of information, poured into like where everybody sits down and listens for 20 minutes while the GM rambles or reads aloud from a box. I like to parcel background information into the setting, sometimes have slightly contradictory views on what a particular piece of information is, or what the history of something is, or, oh, I heard that story a different way. Or, as current politics will show you, people often have very, very different views about very obvious and very seemingly well-documented events, So I think it's really important to have this sort of little mini narratives. And sometimes I think it's important also to make sure that whatever means you're using of purveying that information, whether it be a book or a scroll or a standing stone covered with runes or an NPC who seems particularly chatty, I think it's important, or even an enigmatic raven that lands in your windowsill and squawks something at you. I think it's really important also to understand what their attitude is about that content, and what their goal is in telling you it, if they are, possessing of an intellect and a will.
You've worked across a whole series of different TTRPGs and games in general.
So many.
Yeah, exactly. You've worked across stuff that has had, a dozen different books and comes from a well-established IP. And you've worked on stuff that might just have one book and there's no other material to draw from. How does creating the sandbox and the side quest differ when you have those two vastly different, extended worlds to use?
Okay, when you're creating sandbox content in an established world, one of the strengths that you can draw from is just association. You can sort of, you can have a particular race or a species of character or a particular silhouette of a spaceship. You can evoke something or a character, and there's this tremendous understanding of what that means. If you are playing a science fiction game of a particular giant franchise, and the mysterious hooded stranger activates a glowing energy sword, I think you pretty much instantly go, oh, it's a Jedi Knight. And you've got all sorts of questions and assumptions. And even if you think, oh, is that a Jedi Knight? What the heck is going on? There's all sorts of interesting investment you already have in that. Just like in, for example, The Lord of the Rings, there's a bit where you see mysterious runes scratched on a wall. You immediately think of dwarves and their making and whatnot. So there's a lot of that. And also, quite frankly, there's celebrity cameos and whatnot, where just a particular familiar character might be enough to make people have this whole symphony of emotional and experiential connections that they'll already bring to that you don't need to do anything about for a GM. You just have to sort of, plink a single note, and the players will hear the rest of that symphony, and you can use that to your advantage. The downside is that sometimes you have the problem of, when you want to have something be discrete and atomic and only relating to itself, people come in with a huge amount of assumptions that they want to bring up. And, I bring up this occasionally, where I was running a particular game and I mentioned that somebody had a purple tunic on, and there was this like, oh, I wonder what that means. And everyone's like, well, that blah, blah. And that might mean that they're a ranking member of this particular thing. And then I was thinking, well, no, maybe they just like the color. It was a gift. They like the color. That's it. They're not making a statement about their political affiliation or whatnot. And when you're working, on the flip side of that, when you're working on sort of these context-free games, or rather where everything is encapsulated in a new franchise or a new IP or something that exists in and of itself, I think it's important to also sort of hint at the greater picture, little mysterious half messages or implications that there's a greater story being told somewhere else that you're only getting a little glimpse of it. And sometimes making the players work for trying to get pieces of a larger narrative in the course of their gameplay, not necessarily like having to roll and giving them a clue and then roll again and giving them a clue, but as they progress throughout a narrative or even a sandbox world and explore, they get more and more pieces of a big picture and pieces of the world at large. And from a creative point of view, it's always nice to just, dot manuscripts with these weird little factoids and little bits of lore. I like to put them in like a different font or a little sidebar text or something like that, just so if I have any control over the graphical appearance of stuff, so that the GM can find that kind of stuff. And, there's also putting together things like rumor tables. I love rumor tables and random facts and just the kinds of things that you find in randomly talking to strangers. I think RuneQuest has them. I love games whenever I see a random things you'll hear from strangers at a market square or in a tavern, and so I dig that stuff.
I asked you previously about some advice for people who might be writing and putting together this kind of information. What about if you're just running it? Do you have any GM tips for people who are pulling that content out or who are making their own?
Okay. Well, the first thing I would give is a strong word of caution. Don't bait a hook and dip it into the water unless you are really ready for the player characters to bite. And it's sort of an infamous a thing where the player characters, there's a sort of a channel of narrative laid before them, and then they see something over there, or a NPC just mentions some random detail or has a particularly interesting look to them, and the entire story that the game master prepared is diverted while the player characters really need to get to the bottom of who that guy is over there and what his story is, when then they're just meant as background color. I think it's really important to be careful about, you don't want to, like I said, you don't want to bait a hook unless you're prepared for somebody to bite. And the other thing, though, as a GM is, keep things light. If people can be wrong about things, and that's wonderful. They can occasionally there can be misunderstandings, or like if you find that a particular avenue of investigation is leading to unsatisfying gameplay, like people are barking up the wrong trees or things are turning in a way that the players and the game master are not happy about, you can say, oh, it was just a horrible misunderstanding, and reverse it, try to steer them back with, lure them with other little pieces of candy strewn around on a little trail of breadcrumbs in another direction. But ideally, you can use these sort of little clues and things as wonderful ways to prompt people back to the particular desired narrative. It could be that somebody says, oh yeah, you should go talk to that old lady over there, or that mysterious dwarf, and then people go and talk to them, and then they find out, oh, well, I can't really talk to you about that one thing, or, oh, that turned out to be no problem at all, but there's this other thing that is a problem, sort of like, what was that show 24, the sort of narrative structure where almost every episode they introduce a new problem. Jack Bauer has to go and kill his way through a whole bunch of guys, and then he finds the person, and then they say, oh, I can help you, but what I need is X. And so that, like, I can tell you where the bomb is, but the the fuses are all concealed over here, and it's in a safe, and we got to impersonate ourselves. There's usually all sorts of a complication, and then they get to that challenge, and then that sends them on to the next challenge, and that kind of stuff can be fun, sort of creating these little obfuscatory stages in an adventure or in side quest detail. So you can always add a wrinkle.
What about advice for players? When you get exposed to this kind of content, what's the best way to interact with it? Is there a risk of getting too into it or not steering in enough?
I personally think it's really important to not try to metagame it, to try to avoid thinking about, like, well, what is the most strategic approach to this particular problem? And this, I say, focus on the role playing. I mean, if your character wouldn't be interested in that, why do you think that this is being offered as gameplay? And I mean, your game master ideally has thought through is this something that is interesting to your character? And if there is no compelling reason for a player character to do a particular thing or to pursue a particular avenue of inquiry, then why force them to? I mean, if for example, if you're not playing an investigative horror game, then maybe your character doesn't need to find out what that mystery. They can just say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to back away from that. That seems a little too scary. Let's call the police. Or that is clearly a larger problem than I can deal with. But again, too, there's sometimes you need to understand as a player that when the GM is feeding you this information, there might be a reason for it. It's kind of the flip side, is that the game master could be sort of dropping some breadcrumbs to try to lead you somewhere. And don't stonewall them. Don't just go, no, not going to follow that, not interested. I mean, I've run games that went disastrously when player characters just absolutely refused the call to action. One or two players were just like, we're not going to do that, no. And so I said, well, I guess we can spend the rest of the game with all of you sitting in a tavern drinking, but I had some adventure plans. So if you choose to not take that adventure, then I guess we'll rescope the campaign to be more of a drinking and gambling game.
How is it different to create sandbox and side quest material for a TTRPG versus a video game?
The biggest difference between creating sandboxy stuff for an MMO or just a regular single player or small group role-playing game versus a tabletop game, whether it be a board game or actual role-playing game, which is primarily the case, is repetition. And frequently the game master can add some nuance in a personal adventure, and really only doing a single thing is necessary. You want to keep it simple, but you also want to keep it very basic. And your goals can be sort of fluid and achievable through a few different tactics. Whereas for MMOs, particularly where you've got to actually script a side quest to have very rigid parameters about what succeeds and what fails, what conditions can this be completed, and whatnot, that both, there's not a lot of room for flexibility. You either have to kill the guy or you don't kill the guy. That's it. But the other thing is repetition. Like a side quest for an MMO might be, well, I need you to kill 15 Thunderhoof bandits, and you go out and you fight a bunch of Minotaurs. Okay, I've just killed 15 bandits. Meanwhile, I was also trying to collect 18 sacred talismans. And so you're, trying to kill the bandits, and I got my 18 sacred talismans at the same time. In an MMO, these are two overlapping quests. They might, you might be doing the same activity, but it counts for multiple achievements. Doing those kinds of quests for tabletop gaming is absolutely absurd. I mean, there's no reason at all you should have to have these sort of grindy, like, does the monster drop the item quests? run forward, collect 15 soil samples and then come back, and you run out and activate your shovel and watch a little timer wheel go around, and then you ding, okay, I got the thing. All right, go back, and you run up to another dirt pile and activate your shovel. So, there's like the repetition basically. Tabletop quests or side quests or side tasks should be one and done primarily. You do a thing, you get to take care of it. If somebody says, I need, oh, could you go get me something from this area? Then you go, and it doesn't matter how many, you just get the thing and you succeed with it, rather than, all of these like timer based issues or repetitive killing of monsters or whatnot, which are all just absolutely dull. So I would say try to avoid that kind of stuff in your tabletop gameplay. And ideally, if you happen to be an MMO designer, try to think of better and more interesting things to do than just send characters out to kill 10 rats and collect 6 sacred rat tails, at the same time, because we're on to that as players and it doesn't really add a lot.
I mean, this is all great advice. And I think this sums up really how you can create your own content, what you should be doing when you're running it, and what you should be doing when you're playing it. Do you have any last thoughts? Anything I didn't ask you that you want to share?
Yeah, I would say, I think that it, absolutely. Whereas sandbox gaming is a particular flavor. It is not for everyone. I find that oftentimes sandbox gaming can be challenging for new GMs, because they are often forced to improvise and think on the fly about like create characters out of whole cloth that didn't exist a while ago, try to imagine what they look like. And there are all sorts of little tricks and tools for that. I mean, come up with a list of names that you just have ready to go. Like, here's some character names of whatever genders are appropriate. Maybe even a clue or some visual tics that are interesting, like, oh, this person's always scratching their forehead, or, he seems very pompous, and, he's always talks down to you quite a bit. You can add these little personality quirks that instantly feel like a fully recognized, realized character, without having to do all the homework or even create a character sheet or anything like that. Another cheat I do personally is I have a very, very simplistic view of how much information you need for NPCs. And I find generally I just grab whatever character background sheet is available at any time, and I will, I'll use wildly inappropriate NPC stat blocks to represent NPCs and just adjust them on the fly. If I absolutely need a number, there you go, there's a number. But otherwise, it's not necessary that the stable boy has exactly the same character sheets between sessions, or even that he has a character sheet at all. He might have, boar player characters 50%, and make that roll. Like RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu used to be quite great about introducing these sort of random NPC skills that were wonderful for characterizing the NPCs, but didn't have any actual gameplay effects. So I would say just create a bunch of background information or little quirks or little bits that are funny, weird skills or whatnot, and just have them ready to go if you find that spinning this stuff up on the fly is too much of a challenge. So that's how I generally advise doing that.